Yes, what a title, right? Thank you, Pastor Nina. That's true. That was the first thing I saw when I put this together. I said, sounds like a legal term, so we'll kind of get into that a little bit. Well, welcome everybody here tonight. Welcome to all of our online viewers. Thank you for choosing us tonight. It's such another tremendous, blessed week of weather. Too bad it's so dry. We've been praying on Thursday night for rain. So we just have to trust the Lord that it's going to come. It was great to see Ray Allen back teaching. Lots of very provocative, interesting questions. It was mostly in Matthew, chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. So I recommend watching the replay on that. There's some very interesting things there. So if you like what you hear today, there's a Give Here button on the home page for myamc.org. It's on the third row from the top of the page. There's a big red donate button there, so you can't miss it. All of our teachings are there. A lot of work, again, went into creating that list for a smartphone, a tablet, a PC. So do utilize that. So tonight's message, we're going to be picking it up in Hosea chapter 4. Verses 1 through 19 tonight. I don't think anybody has we have people with Bibles here. I'm sure you have Bibles online. I know we have them on our phones, but I'll give you a second here to turn to Hosea chapter 4, verse 1. And so the title tonight, Indictment of Unfaithfulness. So what is an indictment? You've heard the term before. I'll define it for you. It's a formal charge or an accusation of a serious crime. It's a legal term. Usually a formal written statement framed by a prosecuting authority and found by a jury, such as a grand jury, charging a person with an offense. And that's what we're going to hear tonight from Hosea. It's very relevant today. We'll probably hear this continued on tomorrow in Amos or in the minor prophets. They are very relevant to where we are today. So I'm going to go through for you people who haven't been through the first 3 chapters. I'll just summarize the first 3 of them. First, God suffers exceedingly because of human rebellion against him. I'll give you the themes here. Second, God's love is unconditional. And third, God forgives completely. And so God sends Hosea to Israel during the reign of King Jeroboam II to communicate to the people God's despair over their perpetual idol worship, as well as their dependencies on outside nations, by commanding him to marry a harlot. The first 3 chapters, Hosea's marriage crisis and its analogy with the marriage relationship of God and Israel. The context being the relationship between God and Israel is portrayed in his own personal struggle in his life to send a message, not just by teaching, but by actually doing and showing. Very rare that you'll see that happen in the Bible, but this is a unique situation. So what we have here are 2 marriages, God and Israel, Hosea and Gomer, and they're interwoven as you go through these first 3 chapters. And as we begin Hosea 4, now we have a little bit of a slight change in the direction of where Hosea is going. So in the first series, he begins with an exhortation. If you've got your Bibles here in these first couple of verses, he exhorts them to pay attention. And then there's a confrontation about the shortcomings of the people in their attitude toward God. He follows this up with a warning the consequences that will follow. So the picture here is this: God's commanded him to take this action, to marry this harlot and go through these different things, this marriage experience. And so as he's in this community, days and months are going by, his community is seeing this behavior being played out. And just imagine being part of this community and the kind of message it sends out to the people. Like, they probably were thinking, who is this guy? He says he's a prophet, and what is he doing? He claims he's doing the Lord's work, but all kinds of backbiting and backstabbing are going on. If you read some of the commentaries, that was what was going on. Now, in this fourth chapter, probably months have gone by. And so imagine Hosea delivering this message to the people gathered. Perhaps they're in a sanctuary, probably at Bethel, possibly in the context of an appointment. Maybe it's tabernacles. But his aim now is to get the priests and the people to listen, to think, and to respond, and to change their ways. There's a series of sayings that they do run into each other. So in verses 1 through 3, he confronts them directly. And then there's a response in verses 4 through 5. He then brings a challenge to the priests, speaking specifically to the priests. And then in verses 10 through 14, he challenges the people as a whole. And then in 15 through 19, another warning of calamity to come. And so what we have going on here is these people aren't getting the message. They're not responding to the actions. They're not believing. They think he's a false prophet. They're mocking him, mocking his family. No doubt his credibility as a prophet is questioned. After all, why would God tell a prophet to marry a prostitute? I mean, if anything, their hearts are hardened. If anything, their hearts are hardened against Israel. Much like the time when Moses went into Pharaoh, right? He went in Exodus 7 and 8. And what happened? We see God's hardening Pharaoh's heart. But God's not letting up. He doesn't blink. I've always said that. We try to go eye to eye with the Lord, and it's not blinking. It's not going to blink in these end times. If anything, he's turning up his anger. So now Hosea speaks to the people. I'm going to use the ESV translation, and there's 19 verses here. I'm just going to go through them. Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy, the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. Yet no one contend, and let no one accuse, for with you is my contention, O priest. Right now he's getting specific. You shall stumble by day. The prophet also shall stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. Now it's getting real personal. Verse 6, really you should take this next verse, write it on a 3x5 card. This is probably one of those verses you need to memorize. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of God, I will also forget your children. The more they increased, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory into shame. They feed on the sin of my people. They are greedy for their iniquity. And it shall be like people, like priests. I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They shall eat but not be satisfied. They shall pay the whore but not multiply, because they have forsaken the Lord. To cherish whoredom, wine, and new wine, which take away the understanding. My people inquire of a piece of wood, and their walking staff gives them oracles. For the spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have left their God to play the whore. They sacrifice on the tops of mountains and burn offerings on the hills, under oak, poplar, terebinth, because their shade is good. Therefore, your daughters play the whore, and your brides commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cult prostitutes, and a people without understanding shall come to ruin. Though you play the whore, O Israel, let not Judah become guilty. Enter not into Gilgal, nor go up to Beth Aven, and swear not, as the Lord lives. Like a stubborn heifer, Israel is stubborn. Can the Lord now feed them like a lamb in a broad pasture? Ephraim is joined to idols. Leave him alone. When their drink is gone, they give themselves to whoring. Their rulers dearly love shame. A wind has wrapped them in its wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. So doing a little bit of the research here, I'm going to give you some of the exegesis that I did on this. Verses 1 through 19. Listen to God's word, Israelites, because God has a confrontation with the people who live in the earth. Because there's no truthfulness and no commitment, and there's no acknowledging of God in the earth. Oath-taking, deception, murder, theft, adultery, they've spread out. Bloodshed has followed hard on bloodshed. Therefore the earth will wither, and everything that lives in it will be wasted. With the creature of the open country, and with the bird of the heavens, and also the fish of the sea, they will be gathered up. Yet no one is to confront, and no one is to reprove, your people being such as do confront a priest. You will collapse today. A prophet will also collapse with you by night, and I will cut off your mother. My people are cut off through lack of knowledging, because you are one who has rejected acknowledging. I reject you from acting as priest in relation to me. You've disregarded your God's instructions. I will disregard your children. I too. In accordance with the number of them, so they've done wrong in relationship to me, their honor I will change to being slighted. Off my people's wrongdoing they eat. For their waywardness they raise each his appetite. And it will be like people, like priests. I will attend to its ways for it, its deeds I will give back to it. So they eat, but they will not be full. They've hoarded, but they will not spread out, because they've abandoned him to observe whoring and wine and new wine that takes their minds. My people, of its piece of wood it asks things, of its sticks that informs it, because a downright whorish spirit, it has led it astray. They've whored away from being under their God. On the tops of mountains they sacrifice, on the hills they burn incense, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because its shade is good. Therefore your daughters whore, and your granddaughters-in-law they commit adultery. I will not attend to your daughters, because they whore, or your daughters-in-law because they commit adultery. Because those men, they go off with whores, with these hierodols. Sorry, I might get the translation of that, but it doesn't sound good. These hierodols they sacrifice, and a people that does not consider, it will tumble. If you're a whore, Israel, Yehuda is not to incur guilt, so don't come to Gilgal. Don't go up to Beth-aven, and don't swear as God lives. Because like a cow running amok, Israel has run amok. Now God will pasture them like sheep in a meadow. Ephraim is attached to its idols, let it be. Though their drinking has stopped, they've whored and whored. Its shields dearly, love being slighted. A priest has bound it up in its wings, and they will be ashamed by their sacrifices. So a little bit of some of the interpretation I got out of this in verse 1, he tells them to listen up, saying that the problem is not just with Israel, but it's with the whole world. He is saying that everything that could be wrong is wrong, which could be Hosea trying to get the people to think of the bigger picture in terms of God's perspective, and that Ephraim, these 10 northern tribes, and the conduct, they are part of the bigger picture, not really becoming of a people that God has called my people. God is not going to send a prophet like Hosea to his church. We make that clear. He's already sent his prophet. He sent his son. He doesn't need to send any more prophets. Everything we need for life is contained in the Word and in his Son. Acts 17, verse 28. In him we live and move and have our being. There will, however, be many false prophets who claim to be a prophet and will deceive many. Many in the church, sadly, not the elect. We will all see people who we thought were strong believers in these end times. They will fall prey to this false prophet. It's right around the corner, days, weeks away, maybe even months. False prophets can be found every Sunday morning when you flip through the channels, and many of them even claim to be a prophet, claiming if you buy their book or send in a donation to their ministry, we see it all the time. God is against that. Truthfulness and commitment are the characteristics of believers that know God and want to continue with him. They are discerning people. Anything that you buy from a ministry that steers you away from God and towards their solution based on what God told them is a false prophet. It's not truth and lacks commitment. Takes you away from the Word. Except for you to, only commitment we have, and it's not a good one, is for you to send them a donation once a month. That's a commitment. It's not a good one. Hosea applies that assumption to the world, not just Israel. Acknowledging God comes everywhere in the Old Testament. But Hosea can use God to refer to God elsewhere. And acknowledging God has a meaning similar to acknowledging that he is Lord. But speaking in terms of God rather than God fits a declaration about the earth's people as a whole. And there are parallels to this in the second portion of the Ten Commandments. One might see the expectation implied to be analogous with that. Right? We have the first section of the commandments talking about man and his relationship with God, and then man has a relationship with his fellow man. For Israel, at least, acknowledging God meant serving God alone, putting away images, using God's name properly, and keeping the Sabbath. And committed truthfulness means honoring parents and not murdering, not committing adultery, not doing theft, not perjuring, and not coveting. Our God finds other characteristics in the world, if you look in verse 2, in place of the virtues or values that he misses. And the list is a pretty interesting inventory if you read that. But it supports the possibility that God is taking up an argument on behalf of the victims of these practices. Murder, theft, and adultery are 3 acts forbidden in the 10 Commandments. And so in that context, deception then makes one think especially of a false testimony. Though elsewhere in the Word he refers more generally to defrauding or harming or oath-taking. And if you read these 2 verses, particularly verses 2 and 3, you're going to see that God is calling an indictment against humanity, much similar to what he did in Genesis just before the flood, Genesis 6:11 through 13. Verse 3 starts with this. It starts with a therefore. Most of your versions have that. It's the Hebrew word al-ken, an account of consequences that have already come about. It really means this. So that's why. So replace the therefore. So that's why. But here in verse 3, it's a threat rather than an explanation. Reminded that during the reign of Jeroboam, the world was in a reasonably settled state. We know that would not stay that way. And then this threat takes up the references to the earth. The world's waywardness will issue in the world's withering. The countryside will respond to its people's waywardness by failing to produce a harvest and by wasting away. Everything means the creatures of the open country, the birds of the heaven and the fish of the sea, which replace the thing that moves on the ground and gives the emphasis. Verse 3 refers to the world as a whole. So God brings the world into this, not just Israel. And both of these, we can make a comparison in Genesis 1, where he is talking about the land, the sky, and the sea. He's giving a warning. He's giving a warning here to Ephraim not to rest on the promises in chapter 2, as if the realities and dangers of the wider world were not real. Instead of being a friend, the natural world sometimes can be a threat. Gathering up is what happens at harvest, right? But it's also what happens when you die. Verses 4 through 5, the opening part of this, found this rather interesting. Hosea brings an argument against Ephraim that he says this, that might appear that he would surely welcome. We like the idea of God condemning other people. Yeah, sure, but yet the world's withering and wasting will be bad news for Ephraim as for anyone else. Ephraim is, in fact, part of this world. Maybe it's part of the world by its failure in relationship with God and the community and the lifestyle. Hosea is reminding the people of expectations that apply to them. And he's telling them that you're part of this problem right now, and you need to straighten up. Maybe when you straighten up, the world will follow you. Examples, we see that happening today. That's our responsibility today. Verse 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. So the response to the priest comes in the form of a word from God. If you look at that, there are 3 indictments. There are indictments within another indictment. Right? My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And then he goes with the second part of that. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will reject you. I'll reject you from being a priest today to me. And then because you have forgotten the law of your God, I will forget your children. 3 indictments within an indictment. It's described as being so certain as if it had already happened. As the priest spoke of your people, God speaks of my people. And so there was a sadness, when he uses the word cut off, it's like a noun, about my people. And explaining the cutting off talks about what will happen because of the failure to acknowledge God, which Hosea spoke. It's now explicit that his failure extends to Ephraim itself. Yet God says, you've rejected me, so I reject you from acting as a priest. It's pretty severe a judgment that he's bringing. He's getting specific, talking to the priests. Whatever is to happen in the sanctuary where he ministers, this priesthood will not continue to operate there. Whatever sacrifices that they continue to offer in that sanctuary, he's saying that the Lord won't accept them. They are meaningless and ineffective. God restates the point by redefining refusal to acknowledge God as putting his instruction, his Torah, out of mind. The translation of the verb for disregard in the Hebrew, sakah, is forget. But it also denotes the kind of forgetting one does on purpose. One deliberately takes no notice. God is again referring back to the substance of the thought, not the words of the indictment that he said in verse 1. Sometimes God's forgetting is good news, can forestall punishment. It's not good news here. God then repeats the key verb. The priest has put God's instructions out of mind. God will put the priest's children out of mind. The priest has threatened Hosea's mother. God's warning threatens the priest's children. All the priests are involved in the wrongdoing. No exceptions. In relation to me, he picks up with the same expression in verse 6 and explains the statement here. God will therefore take action against them. They are in a position of honor as priests. Their privilege is to facilitate the people bringing their needs, their prayers, and worship before God, and thus to open up the way to God answering people's prayers, bestowing his blessing and granting them increase in security in their relationship with the nations around them. And he's telling them that you failed. You failed in your duty as a priest. And the consequences of that are that it's going to affect all the people now. All the people aren't going to be able to trust in their priests. This is just one of the most severe judgments that's coming to Israel they can possibly have. And the rejection that God declares will mean they're losing their honorable position. They will not merely be taken down to the same level of honor as lay people. This is a humiliation, really, to them. So we've got judgment with the priests, humiliation. Let's make a comment here. I wrote this down. Priests and pastors can feed off their sheep rather than feeding them. So the people are as guilty as the priest and will pay the same penalty. God will attend to their ways. In verses 15 through 19, no question whether Ephraim is going around in illicit behavior. It's a snide note worthy of Amos. Hosea asks Ephraim, therefore, please, to avoid leading the nation to the south by example and taking them with you and leading them astray so that Judah would not attract God's negative attention. So Hosea asks the Ephraimites this. He says to stay away from certain sanctuaries. His concern for Judah makes him ask them not to include Gilgal and Bethel in the sanctuaries they patronize. Both of these lie in the south, just near the border with Judah. And both are places with a history for Israel as a whole, going back to Joshua, to Jacob, and to Abraham. So one can imagine what these people of Judah are doing there. Joshua's base camp near Jericho was at Gilgal, where the crossing of the Jordan was commemorated. It was also where the monarchy was inaugurated. If you look at 1 Samuel 11:15, Hosea's point is not affected. Beth-aven, right? Or Beth-aven. What that means? House of wickedness, trouble. It's a derogatory alternative for Bethel. So God is mocking this place. To turn Bethel into the house of another god means a kind of violence being done to both fact and name. It's in the highlands, so no one goes up there. Tells them, don't pollute Gilgal and Bethel with your whorish presence, says Hosea. To make this point even more clear, he adds, if you're going to indulge in your whoring, don't also take the name of God on your lips, will you? If you don't trust in God, but trust in your various other deities, it doesn't make sense to swear an oath in God's name, which would be one of the acts one undertook in going to a sanctuary. Such swearing needs to be done with truthfulness and faithfulness. So as an alternative to the term whoring, Hosea goes on in verse 16 and says this. He compares Ephraim's behavior with a cow running amok and turning aside out of the way the farmer is seeking to direct it. Israel is running amok and turning aside. The cow thinks it's going to get good pasture that way. Is the farmer simply going to adapt to it? Rather, God is going to let the cow have its way. Let Ephraim worship the idols it's drawn to. Hosea likes designated divine images to idols. This word in the Hebrew, asab, likely means something shaped, which makes it not so different from the word image, but the word idol also resonates with a verb that means hurt, pain, or to grieve. And so this chapter finishes up with a reference to its shield, that is, the people who are supposed to be the protectors of the city. He challenges the leaders of Ephraim. These shields have behaved as if they are attached to shame or slighting. Their behavior is going to take them to this fate. It's as if they have been bewitched. This whoring spirit has led these people astray, to which Hosea will refer back again. They will carry the shield to the shame that properly issues from their offering sacrifices to other deities. They will not merely be ashamed, but also shamed. God's expectation of the world are not so different from his expectations of his people. He assumes that the world knows the basics about the proper stance toward God, that God looks for. Look in Romans 1:3. It involves truthfulness, commitment and acknowledgement of God. Commitment denotes faithfulness, and that goes even further in showing a steadfast surpassing what anyone has a right to expect, and in maintaining such steadfastness, even if the other party has forfeited any rights to it, takes discipline. Acknowledgement of God doesn't denote knowledge of facts about God or an intimate personal relationship of God like that of children for a father. Well, the broader context of what Hosea is saying is that there are none who walk in the awe of God. God also assumes that the world knows the basics about the proper style of community life, or of the acts that destroy community life. Which you can see in the Ten Commandments, the moral style of community life that God looks for is a just life. It's a life that understands his commandments. And a wise style of community life respects both halves of the Ten Commandments. It's possible and tempting to focus on worshiping and our own personal relationship with God, and to pay less attention to doing right by others, or to focus on matters of justice and to pay less attention to our relationships with other people. The indictment against the priests and people in Hosea 4 says that the connection between the knowledge of God and ethical behavior within the community, and presents the failure to maintain this relationship with God in terms of the devastation that's going to take place in the natural world. God may respond to unfaithfulness in several ways. God may take deliberate action in attending to it, which may involve giving their deeds back to the people, taking action to ensure that their deeds have their natural effect, or God may let the people have their way. But God may simply let the withering and wasting of nature happen. This consequence of a stupid community lifestyle can work itself out in a natural way. God reflects interwovenness within reality as a whole. We see some of this going on in our world today. God's just, we say, why aren't you doing something, Lord, about this? And God says, I am. I'm not doing it the way you would like me to do it. While the people of God are responsible for their own acknowledgement of God, leaders, such as priests, prophets, pastors, and teachers, are responsible to urge and facilitate that acknowledgement. It's our job. Hosea's warning about creation in jeopardy is thus a warning to the priests, and teachers pay a price for failing to teach the true word of God. They will no longer be able to exercise their ministry. They may do so in a formal sense, that is, they can act like a priest or a pastor or a prophet, but God may not recognize what they do. This is a very, very appropriate and relevant message for today. Let things go amok, and we as a nation will reap the consequences. Not taking time every day in His Word, will result in consequences. Allowing apostate messages for us to even hear them, which steers us away from God. Think about that. They leave us empty. They leave us confused, distraught, wondering, God, where is this all going? And how does it work? We have these people who are gifted in the way they speak, gifted in the way they are able to get up in front of a lot of people, but their messages are not full of truth. So we need to pay attention to what's going on, and take this message seriously as a warning to us as a nation that there are changes we need to do. We need to make individually, small and big. that will affect not only us, but affect our relationship with God. And so take that to heart tonight. Reflect on these 19 verses and ask the Lord to tell you how they apply to you.